Is a $15,000 analog EQ worth it, or is a $300 plugin just as good? To answer this, let's go back to September 2022. Now, I began seeing photos of this guy on my socials from my friend Brandon over in the States. That guy in the photo is none other than Burgess McNeil, one of the grandfathers of the parametric EQ who had designed the original Sontec alongside George Massenburg. First, the MEP130 as a console module, and that was then re-released as a standalone MEP230 unit in 1971 for $1,460, which is the equivalent of $10,000 in today's money adjusted for inflation. Now, they did that before producing what is synonymous today with the Sontec brand, the MES 430 units. MES standing for Mastering Engineers Switch. The MES 430 was originally made for their own cutting room and eventually manufactured at ITI Audio as a tool to assist cutting engineers. Anyway, back to this photo. I reached out to Brandon to find out what was up with it. It turns out, and to no surprise if you're watching this video, this was the plug-in version of the Sontec EQ, and this was before it was released, but not done by some third party, but designed alongside and given the sign-off from the person who designed the original unit, Burgess McNeil. So back in September, before this Sontec plugin was even released, I reached out to Brandon and he sent me blind AB files from the team at Make Believe Studios who were developing this plugin with Metric Halo. Now, I don't have those blind ABs anymore because they sat in my downloads folder and I deleted them, but I didn't know what the contents of those files were. It turned out that one was a Pro Q3 matching the Sontec, another was the Sontec emulation, another was the Sontec emulation in aggressive mode, and another one was the actual analog unit. Then I went on to level match them further because there was a few little discrepancies, but then I did an A/B test, and across 20 tests, I picked the aggressive mode of the Sontec emulation as my favorite sounding 80% of the time. And that's pretty considerable. So now fast forward to today, we're in February 2023 and it's been out in the market, this plugin, for a couple of months. And what I ended up doing is I reached out to a colleague of mine with the actual hardware Sontec MES 430, and he actually let me go over to the studio, run some settings through the unit, so I have some blind AB files to compare to the plugin.
Yeah, at Deluxe Mastering, Tony was kind enough to let me the room for a little bit to play around with the Sontec MES 432. I've printed some test files to A/B them between that and the plugin, and I'm really curious to see how this goes. Everything's level matched, and yeah, it was really fun using this. I will say the one thing I don't miss about the plugin version is that everything latches left to right. I control the left, it controls the right. But
so first, let's have a listen to the tests I ended up setting up for myself. I'm going to play back the original mix, then the analog unit, the plugin, the analog unit, the plugin, the analog unit, the plugin, and then I'll share the results of my blind tests. So I ended up doing 40 blind tests across these 4 various EQ settings between the analog and the digital plugin, basically using blind AB, playing it through, and then trying to guess which one was which. And here are the results. I could tell the difference between the two units 52.5% of the time, which in other words means I couldn't tell the difference. As much as I wanted to feel like I was listening, these were the results. A 1 means I got it right, a 0 means I got it wrong. And that's the sum tally, and that's the average. I didn't like, it's not that I didn't do well, it's just that it is a very, very good emulation of a hardware unit. It is incredible that I can't distinguish that difference so easily, and I've spent a lot of time with it, and I've even been using it in my sessions, so I would think I'd be able to pick out the plug-in sound over the hardware sound, and I just couldn't. But I had to tempt fate. What about other emulations, like the T-Rex Master EQ 432? Across 30 blind tests, I was able to pick it out 60% of the time. However, there was something really interesting. About 70% of the time, I was able to pick out the low-end EQ changes. The rest of it was 40%, which makes me feel like it's relatively really close. But in the low end, I felt like there was a big difference, a discernible difference. And that was the fact that the T-Rex low end was grittier. It wasn't as smooth and as clean. I could feel the subs, I don't know, breaking up or harmonics. There was just something really weird happening down there, and that's every time I heard that is when I said it was the T-Rex in the double blind test, and that was 70% of the time I was getting it right because I was hearing that very subtle difference in the low end. Now, if you'd like to download these WAV files with all my A/B tests, the analog version, the Sontec version, the T-Rex version, feel free to subscribe to the newsletter in the link below. So I was super fortunate to sit down with Rick Carson, who owns Make Believe Studios and was one of the main drivers and operators of building this plugin alongside Metric Halo and Burgess. And the first question I happened to ask him was a cheeky one, and that is, why create a Sontec plugin when there are already emulations out there? And here's what he had to say.
Okay, well, this is a multi-pronged thing, but, I really believed in the technology that we were working on with Metric Halo when it came to the state space model extraction process. And I've had a personal relationship with Burgess for on the better side of a decade now. He's just a friend of mine. We like talking to each other on the phone, and it came to the point where I was like, we floated the idea. Burgess had always talked to me about people coming to him to try and model the Sontec over the past 10 years. I was the guy on the other side of that phone call when someone would show up calling Virginia trying to make a 432 and, officially license it. He would call and, we would joke about it. And for the longest time, I was an engineer and a studio owner. I was not, running a software company. So I wasn't really in a position to even have a conversation outside of, it'd be cool if there was a really great Sontec plugin, And me being familiar with Sontec and a fan of Sontec, of course, that led me to try the Sontec style equalizers that were available on the market, which you've brought up a couple of those, And I'm not going to get into each and every plugin's deficiencies, but there were things that I felt were lacking. And when it came to trying to make not only plugins in general, but something like the Sontec, those things we really wanted to try and make as good as we possibly could. We wanted it to sound as good as we could possibly make it, and we wanted it to have very, very low resources as far as, CPU usage. And I think we accomplished those goals tremendously, all thanks to BJ and Joe over at Metric Halo.
Now, the next thing I spoke about, Rick, was the technology behind the modeling of this Sontec. And Metric Halo uses state space modeling. State space modeling can be described as a mathematical representation of a physical system as a set of input, output, and state variables related by first-order differential equations. Now, that is way high level than my brain understood. that is even outside the scope of what Rick understands, but we still spoke about it. But there happens to be a person called BJ over at Metric Halo who actually operates and is the main vehicle and driver for using this modeling. So before I give you my layman's description of how this technology works, let me know if you'd like me to do an interview with BJ, because that is something that I think I would really be interested in doing, because this technology is very unique, and I'll explain why. Now, you go to an Acustica Sontec plugin model. It has tens of thousands of iterations of different impulse responses. I don't know if it's tens of thousands, but every possible variation of that analog EQ, half a dB here, plus dB there, whatnot, it has impulse responses. So basically, you set that EQ, it finds that image, and then it represents that image on the signal path. Now, state space modeling, to the best of my knowledge, now I may be wrong with some of this, uses data sets to extrapolate a series of equations which then represent the final output of the process. So basically it still does the same thing, where it takes hundreds of or thousands of different impulse response images, but then it uses that data to create equations predictably to understand how that unit will work or interact with the signal. So the difference between state space modeling and like impulse response modeling, which is what Acustica does, is that the impulse responses are ignorant to one another. So those impulse responses might be accurate images of that particular unit, but there's no algorithm behind it or no equation informing the processor as to why it is doing that. Whereas with the state space modeling, those variable changes become algorithms which are responsive to itself. I don't know if that's a good explanation. This is why I want to get BJ on. So let me know if you want me to get BJ from Metric Halo 1. I'll try tee it up. I'll try get Rick in and go, hey, let's tee this up, because I really want to understand and people want to know about it, and we'll do that. But anyway, and with that said, with that confusing explanation, I'm going to leave you with what Rick had to say about state space modeling.
Yeah, so it's not, the Acustica model where you have a billion different impulse responses for each knob setting. That's a very bloated way to make a plugin, in my opinion. I don't know exactly how the data is handled, and I can tell you that it's not just extrapolated averages, because that's something that's been used for a long time in modeling and didn't give. He calls it real intelligence. So it's one of those things where he knows SpectraFu better than anyone in the world, because he created SpectraFu. So when he's looking at the data that comes from the actual passes that go through a piece of gear, he's able to extrapolate data from that people, and I'm assuming even computers, wouldn't typically be able to do. And then he uses that as well as his brain, to go in and say, this is what's happening here in this audio file. And it's interesting, because when you look at something like a Sontec, everyone wants to say like, oh, I can recreate it with this EQ and I can recreate it with that EQ. But I've seen how the bells on a Sontec work, and, it takes somewhere between 4 and 6 parametric bells just to even get close to recreating that. So, watching how the end result comes out, I can tell he's paying attention to the finer details.
Yeah, because it's almost like it's non-linear. Like as in, you're doing a boost on one band, 1 dB, 2 dB. The Q factor might change slightly in and out as you're boosting it. Then you go to the band next to it and you maybe duck half a dB, but then that it's not a direct one-to-one interaction with the next band. It's variable in a sense. So it's about trying to predict those variations and then matching it up.
Yeah, and on the Sontec, the 3 parametric bands are relatively separate from each other as far as they don't cause too much interaction, but they do cause phase shift, and that phase shift interacts with the frequency response. So like there's a whole lot of things that go into the sound of a piece of equipment, and definitely the Sontec.
Here's my take on this actual plugin. I've got a hardware Barry Point and Net EQ, and I've got this one. And the thing that I find this gives me access to in the digital world that I otherwise don't have is an analog workflow in this sense. Now, understand this. You open up Pro Q3, you can pick any frequency you want, 432 Hertz, 501 Hertz, 66 Hertz, whichever frequency you want. And there can be some analysis paralysis with that. Whereas when you're just trying to shape the tone, and even when I'm using my hardware unit, you have to choose, you have to commit, you have to go, am I going to pick, 100 hertz or 120 hertz? Yes or no? And do I like the sound of it? Yes or no? It's not about, oh, maybe I would have liked 118 or 119. It removes that. You have to make decisions based on what's available there. And that makes you, I don't know, it makes you be a little bit more creative with the decisions you're making. You're discerning a difference between 120 and 140 boost or 120 and 140 cut. Instead of trying to find the perfect frequency to fit it, you have to work with what's there. And I really like that about this workflow. The other thing which is great about the digital version, which you do not get in the analog version, is the fact that the left and right track together. When you're working with analog, and that's actually why I got this built, this Barry Porter EQ built as a stereo linked version. When I was over at Tony Mans's or Jack the Bears, I was having to change the left, change the right channel, change the left, change the right channel. I don't like that. This just makes that workflow quicker. Is it worth it? Now, here's, aside from all my blabbing on, is this plugin worth it? Now, it's $300 US. That is a higher price point for plugins. What it gives you access to now, if this was me 10 years ago, hands down, I would have gotten this straight away. Without a doubt, this gives you access to a tool set that otherwise you will not have. You can't have access to this sound quality. And for me, 10 years ago, I would have been very curious as to how does this Sontech sound? How can I use it in my workflow? So for somebody who is sort of starting out and would like to hear what a Sontech is like, but they don't have 15 grand, yeah, $300, this is absolutely worth it. Is it a cut above the rest of the mustard? I'm going to say yes, because how's this? Look at this T-Rax. I was actually tearing my hair out to set up these blind tests. This interface is shit. I can't read anything. I was squinting my eyes. At least with this one, you can scale it a bit, whatever, and you can see it. It killed me. The T-Rax one was actually really horrible to operate. Even though it might sound good, the low end didn't sound as good as the real Sontech emulation, and the interface was, that's abhorrent. It is a shit interface. And I don't mean to be rude in saying that. I'm being honest in saying that. So yes, $300 for a beginner starting out. It's worth it to get access to it if you don't have 15 grand. Now, an advanced user, the everyday producer, the everyday mixer, is it worth it? If you want that sound, if you want access to a tool like this, it is worth it, because I don't think there's any other emulation that sort of is hitting the mark the way this is. So it's going to be a matter of the fact is, do I want a hardware workflow in my digital environment in terms of having access to this plugin or not? That's going to be the deciding factor as to whether you spend $300 on it or not. Will it replace a Pro Q3? No. Will it replace most other EQs? No, but that's not what it promises to do. However, I have to just, put it out there. It's not going to change the game for you. It's if you want access to this $300, yes, it is worth it. Let me know what your thoughts are on this plugin if you've used it in the comments below, what you think of it, what you think of alternatives, what you think of just in general, plugin emulations in the digital workflow. And until next time, take care.